Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'm going to talk to you about some of the impacts that humans have had on the biosphere. Now, when we get into this kind of discussion about human impacts and how we've disrupted some things, it can be kind of a negative conversation, but I don't want it to be that way. I want it to be sort of a responsible conversation about some of the things that we've done that didn't go well and what are some opportunities that we could sort of right the wrong and change the road we're on. In other words, we want to be able to look back historically at some of these problems, and it'll be a great achievement, a great triumph for humanity to think that we've faced these problems, we faced our selfishness and our misunderstanding of how we can live sustainably, and we can alter that so that we can have a brighter future for every organism on the earth. And so I'm not sure. Again, you have to sort of temper this with knowing my tendencies for hyperbole, but I don't know of a more important conversation than looking at some of these issues and what we could do to improve them. And so, human population, just to right to the chase, cut right to the chase, the human population is really ultimately at the root of some of these difficulties that we're having on the earth. The fact that our population is increasing so high, we're accumulating a lot of the world's resources, and that means we're occupying a lot of habitat as well, and we're doing things to alter the biogeochemical cycles and what have you, and so therefore it's difficult for other species to coexist with us. And so, an example right out of the gate is that just something that seems so benign like agriculture, just the fact that we're so successful at growing so many crops. If you really think about it, agriculture is kind of an unnatural process in which we grow plants in one particular area and then we harvest it. So, in other words, we scoop them all up and then we put it onto a truck and then a train and transport those crops to a new location. And by doing that, we sort of remove the crop biomass. And so we lose a lot of the nutrients that were in those plants. And so it just it's logical to assume that after a while that natural store of nutrient in the soil will become exhausted and depleted. And so it's incumbent upon us, if we want to continue to farm in the same area over and over again, we're going to need to replenish those nutrients. And I know that doesn't seem so detrimental because in some ways it's been quite a triumph. We've been able to add fertilizer to the soil and therefore continue to farm in these areas. But the truth is, since we've been synthesizing and manufacturing these fertilizers, which are um, largely containing nitrogen compounds, the thing is, sometimes we put a little bit too much nitrogen into the soil. And as a result of putting too much nutrient into the soil, we sort of cross over what's known in agriculture as something called the critical load. And this is a key issue. So if we add too much fertilizer, as a result of it, when runoff occurs and irrigation, when water is added to the crops, sometimes those nutrients will cruise off of the crops and actually go into the water sources. And so as a result, um, this may have come up in a previous video if you've been watching these, but I'll bring it up. It's human involvement, intrusion, have disrupted through agriculture the freshwater ecosystem. It's something called cultural, since it's human, eutrophication. So basically, runoff from our agricultural fields and the excessive use of fertilizer, all those nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and what have you, even things like sewage and factory waste and animal waste, for example, if there's cattle being raised on land, all of this gets rushed off into rivers, and that increases the nitrogen and phosphorus levels in creeks and streams and rivers, and ultimately it's going to be the demise of the fish species that live there because it's altering that. And this is called eutrophication. And again, the basis of this is that when there's a lot of runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus, the algae tends to bloom in the area because nitrogen and phosphorus are limited in the aquatic environment. They're limited reagents. And so ultimately, the runoff from agriculture increases phosphates in the water. The algae blooms. Ultimately, it's going to die, and then decomposers are going to decay that. And through respiration, they're going to consume a lot of the dissolved oxygen, and therefore it's going to be trouble for the lake or creek. And so we could see these kinds of things happening. This is an aerial photograph of a big algae bloom right here. So human discharges where there's sewer being released into lakes or into the ocean. You can see this. Detergents that contain phosphorus are often a problem. Agricultural discharges, and as I mentioned, fertilizers that are a problem. Now let's talk a little soil chemistry. I think you might find this to be particularly interesting. So in terms of nutrients in the soil, what we're talking about is these minerals can have electrical charge, and these elements that have electrical charge are called ions. And if they're positive, they're called cations, and if they're negative, they're called anions. And as it turns out, when there's a lot of clay in the soil, it's one of the constituents of soil, clay. Clay, as it turns out, happens to be negatively charged, and so it attracts potassium and copper and potassium and magnesium and calcium. It tends to attract those. And so as a result, cations cling to the soil, and they're not readily run off. And so this is both good and bad. In order for a plant to actually get those cations in, because a plant needs to get magnesium in its roots or potassium. What's interesting about this is that during normal cell respiration, as you may know, carbon dioxide is produced and it's released into the soil from the root. So that, in other words, the roots are breathing, just as we breathe out carbon dioxide. When it reacts with water, it produces carbonic acid, which then dissociates into bicarbonate ion and H+, which creates an acidic environment. And so let me sort of animate this. In creating an acidic environment or a positive environment out here, inside the root is relatively more negative as a result of that. Also, the root can actively pump using membrane proteins. It can actually pump protons into the soil. And as a result of it, it becomes really positive in the soil and negative inside. And as a result of that membrane potential, separation of charge, it attracts those cations away from the clay. And so, therefore, a root can actually get cations into its body, which it needs. Now, okay, why am I talking about this? Well, because it's called cation exchange. In other words, if a root were to release H+, let me do this, it releases H pluses in the soil, it's going to exchange those H pluses for these H pluses. It's going to attract those because inside the root is negative. And so positively charged mineral ions are made available through the plant as a result of this. And so I bring this up because, as it turns out, clay helps to prevent the leaching or the runoff of these positive ions. But in fact, the minerals that are negatively charged, like, let me give you some examples of these. Nitrates and phosphates and sulfates, these are negatively charged ions or anions. Those don't hold on to clay very well. And so when you get a lot of negative ions in the soil, and there's a lot of irrigation or there's a lot of rain, those anions tend to leach or tend to move away from the soil more easily, and therefore those are the ones that are going to go into the creeks and the river and cause more difficulties. So that's the reason why I brought that up. I find that's kind of interesting. So shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about, instead of talking about eutrophication, let's talk about how humans have been really in love with a combustion reaction. Now, this is pretty much combustion powers our world. We love to burn things. We love to burn wood. Okay, we like to burn fossil fuels such as coal and oil, and then ultimately derivatives of oil like gasoline. And so we really need this. This is what really powers our whole economy, and really the whole world, is the combustion of fossil fuels. And so it's not going to be an easy solution to move away from this, but ultimately we've got to, because fossil fuels, for one thing, are finite, and for another thing, the combustion of them, in other words, the burning of them, creates some environmental problems. And so one of the environmental problems of combustion of fossil fuels is this acid rain or acid precipitation. Now, what does it mean? Acid means, as you may know, acid means that the pH is very low. And so it's less than 7. So the pH is very low. And as a result of this, remember, pH has a lot to do with the hydrogen ion concentration. And so let's just look at this. Can you see here where there's a lot of industry, where there's a lot of factories that are producing and burning fossil fuels? You can see that there's a massive increase in acid rain in these particular areas right here. And so what happens is, when these fossil fuels are burned, it releases sulfur oxides and nitrogen compounds into the atmosphere. And these react with the water, and then when it rains, it's actually raining not just pure water, it's raining sulfuric and nitric acid. Yeah, it's pretty frightening. And so as a result of that acid rain, coming down, what it's happening is it's going into the soil. And so this is a measure here in the east coast of the United States of, look at the pH. So 7 is neutral. So all of this is slightly acidic, but this is getting extremely acidic. And so the acid rain could outright kill plants. It could actually kill aquatic organisms as well if it lands in the water, but it's changing the soil pH. And you're like, changing the soil pH. Well, if you don't mind just going back to this for a second, if you change the soil pH, what you're doing is altering the soil's ability to hold on to minerals. And so this acid rain can be rather detrimental, and the plants are not adapted to that, and so it can be quite harmful. And it's also a huge problem. What are you going to do to clean this up? I mean, you could try to neutralize it by adding lime to it. In other words, an alkaline chemical to sort of neutralize it. But then again, you're just trying to mediate a major problem. Ultimately, the source is to reduce these sulfur dioxides in the atmosphere, and have factories have more pollution control that will limit these types of exchanges in the atmosphere. So another concern that we have, sorry for sort of piling up, but another concern that we have in our environment is that we've been able to synthesize, and again, this is a triumph, we've been able to synthesize, I think if you go back historically, even all the way back to the 1940s and 1950s, organic chemists in the lab have been able to produce chemicals that are used in the environment as pesticides. Now, this is something that we can be real proud of in one side, that we've eliminated a lot of pests which are eating our crops or reducing our crop production. And also, we've been able to reduce incidents, like if we're killing mosquitoes, it's reducing that as a vector for carrying lethal diseases like malaria. And so, unfortunately though, some of these chemicals that are pesticides can be rather toxic for other organisms, not only ourselves, but things like birds and other larger organisms like fish. And so the reason this occurs, and it's like, well, how can a pesticide hurt a bird? Well, it's because of a concept called biological magnification. And this is what I want to discuss with you. And that when the toxic chemical is released into the environment, it may be released at a really, really minute, a really small concentration. And even though it's released in the environment in a small concentration, it begins to magnify in terms of its concentration each successive trophic level. And so it may start off as being very remote in the water, very small part per million. But every trophic level, it increases and increases. And this is what we mean by biological magnification. It's kind of like the opposite if you're looking for a picture. it's kind of the opposite of an ecological pyramid, whereas the chemical starts off very small and then it becomes very large as you move up the different trophic levels. And so, as it turns out, humans are the source of this. We're producing these chemicals in the lab and we're dumping them into the ecosystem. Not because we're trying to cause damage, but because we're trying to sort of manipulate and solve some problems that we have. And so, as it turns out that these chemicals are ingested, and when they're ingested, the metabolism, the chemical reactions of the organisms are able to take these chemicals in, but they're not able to excrete them. In other words, just very simply, they're not able to urinate them out, for example. So they accumulate in their body over the course of their lifetime. So think how much food you're eating over the course of your life. So other organisms, for example, a fish, can live for many years and it's eating and eating and eating, and it's accumulating more and more and more of this toxin. And as it turns out, some of these toxins are lipid soluble, meaning that they stay inside their tissues of the body in fat, and so therefore they're not excreted out. And so the concentration increases. Now, again, we didn't make these chemicals just because we wanted to cause damage. We produced a chemical called DDT because we thought it was a good thing. We thought that it was a great pesticide. And so it was actually marketed like in terms of its greatness, and look what it could do. And so as it turns out, it is extremely dangerous because of biological magnification. It's now been banned as a result of it. And why has it been banned? Because our national animal, our national bird, the bald eagle, there was an extreme decline. And now there's many factors for the decline of the bald eagle, but one of them is the fact that their eggs the shell is becoming so thin, and scientists have linked this to an accumulation of DDT in the bald eagle, in the female bald eagles. And so it's showing up, and the eggs are so brittle that they're cracking, and so they're not able to have children. It's really brutal. And so this is also found in falcons as well, and it's causing the eggs to be really thin. And so let's look at the numbers on this. So the chemical DDT, if you were to go in and you're like, well, why are the birds dying? Why are the eagles dying? I don't know, because I'm standing next to the lake and I'm measuring the amount of DDT in the water, and it's so small. Look at this number, parts per million. How can the DDT is not causing a problem? As it turns out, that it's getting into the zooplankton, which are, again, the microscopic animals that are living in the water. And so as a result of that, these smaller fish are eating and eating and eating and eating and eating. And so look at the level. It's actually 0.5 parts per million in these little, like, minnows, we'll say, these small fish. So this bigger fish, how much fish can this fish eat in its life? It's eating and eating and eating and eating. And so though each one of these contains a small amount, over the course of a lifetime, this big fish actually has 2 parts per million in it. Look at the increase, 2 parts per million in this fish. And so then when you get up here to the bird again is eating and eating and eating these fish over the course of a lifetime. And so the DDT in the fish-eating bird is 25 parts per million. If you do the math on that, that's a 10 million increase. This is what we mean by biological magnification, because the level of toxic chemical is increasing or magnifying because of the food chain. And so 10 million, this is why the birds are dying. This is why the bald eagle is in trouble. This is why the herring is in trouble. There's many examples of this. Again, you can look at these numbers going from, here it is 0.025 parts per million, and then jump it up here to 124 parts per million in the egg of the herring. And so this is a real serious issue. We have to get hold of these chemicals and really consider whether or not they're should be banned, whether there should be laws against them. And so more examples, even tuna. You may be familiar with this, that tuna is now becoming difficult to eat because the levels of mercury inside of the tuna, I know we like to have sushi every once in a while, but the levels of tuna, the level of mercury inside the tuna is getting rather toxic. And so if you're eating a lot of tuna, this is accumulating inside of you and it's putting you yourself in harm's way. And it's often been suggested that pregnant women shouldn't be eating tuna because of this. And it's there's so much accumulation of these toxic chemicals in our body that we're sort of walking around chemicals factory, and this actually manifests into, like, for example, particularly important is women who are breastfeeding, and actually a lot of this chemical is actually coming off in the breast milk. I mean, this has got to stop. It's out of control. And so some of these chemicals have been banned, and but what's brutal is here's a chemical called PCBs. They actually still persist in the environment even though they've been banned. And why? Because it's hard to eradicate them. It's hard to clean the environment, and so even putting a stop to it means that it's going to persist for a long time. And so we've seen many examples of this. Even polar bears and whales, all kinds of weird things are happening to them in terms of their reproductive ability because of these PCBs, which are found in like antifreeze for your car. And so that stands for polychlorinated biphenyls. And so again, you're like, well, why are they doing that? Well, we don't think about it. This stuff is in our car, in our refrigerators. It's coating our electrical wires. It's a trade-off. When you create something, you have to really look at its consequences. And so ultimately, somebody needs to take responsibility. Somebody needs to, and I'm hoping that this is, the intention is, by mentioning this to you, is that you will rise now that you're aware. This is a social awareness message which impels to action. So it's time for us to rise and stand up and do something about it and not take it sitting down. And so one of the great pioneers in what I'm talking about, a person who of stand-up character, is one of the greatest female scientists that we have, and sometimes accredited for starting the whole branch of biology called ecology. And her name is Rachel Carson. And Rachel wrote this book, and I happen to have it right here, called Silent Spring. And the name's quite haunting because in this book she talks about how if we keep releasing these chemicals, and in particular she went off on DDT, if we keep releasing these chemicals into the environment, what's going to happen, it's going to reduce bird populations and amphibian populations, and ultimately in the spring, it's sort of a metaphor. You can sort of think about how spring is known for the birds singing and the frogs chirping and all of that. It's going to get really silent. And so it was a call to do something about it. So Silent Spring, I recommend checking it out. It's a pretty good book. And so here's another concern that we have, climate change. Now this is getting a lot of press these days. DDT doesn't get so much press anymore, and acid precipitation doesn't so much, but climate change seems to be on the news all the time. So what's the root of climate change? So climate change is thought to be the major difficulty that the Earth is going through at the moment. I know there's many, but it's again human activities, and the backbone of climate change is that our activities are increasing the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, why is that? Again, through the burning of fossil fuels and combustion. So ever since the Industrial Revolution, when we really started kicking the carbon dioxide into the air, all of our automobiles and factories and all of this produces a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide. Now, what I'm going to be discussing is the effect of carbon dioxide on the climate, but as a side note, as a little tangent, that what happens is carbon dioxide, when it goes into the atmosphere, it's absorbed by the ocean, and what that's doing is it's causing the acidification of the ocean. It's lowering the pH of the ocean, which is affecting the coral reef. So that's a major concern as well for rising CO2. But I'm going to talk about the climate. What's CO2 have to do with the climate? Well, measurements since 1958 to the present suggest that the numbers have gone up for 316 parts per million to almost 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so this has been like rising and rising and rising, the carbon dioxide, which is shown here in black. And what's interesting, though, is that it's correlated to global rising temperature. Do you see how those are sort of overlapped? Temperature increase and carbon dioxide increase over the decades. Now, why is this? Well, because as it turns out, without carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we'd be in big trouble because it's a nice little blanket that surrounds the earth and it keeps us warm. When the light from the sun comes in, a lot of it's sort of reflected off, and the carbon dioxide keeps the warmth in, some of the energy in that would normally escape, and it keeps us warm. We wouldn't be able to survive on this earth without carbon dioxide. But it's just the amount. Again, one blanket's good, 10 blankets, it's not good. So what we call this is a greenhouse because light comes in like through glass and it's retained and it gets really warm like inside of a greenhouse. So sometimes we talk about the greenhouse effect. And so if you want to check this out, if this is something that's of burning interest, you can check out this movie by former Vice President Al Gore. He made a movie called The Inconvenient Truth. And so it's pretty interesting. It's pretty sobering. But basically, the levels have really gotten high. And basically, as far as we know, they're as high as they've ever been, going back for millions of years. And so what's the culprit? It's burning petroleum, which is oil and coal and gas. And so it's combustion that's doing that. And so as a result, carbon dioxide is affecting really the whole earth. And you're like, well, what's the problem if it's a little bit warmer? Well, if it's warmer, it might possibly increase the atmosphere of the earth 2 degrees. And you may not think that that's a big deal, but it really is. When you're talking about how organisms are really adapted to their environment, it's going to have dramatic changes in terms of what vegetation can live and how much rainfall, and it's going to cause some extreme conditions which could be detrimental. One of the things that you've probably heard of is the fact that the polar ice caps are starting to melt, which could cause a rising of ocean levels and actually an introduction of fresh water, which is what ice is, into the water, which changes the salinity, which affects the current and upwelling, and there can be major climate change as a result of the polar ice caps melting because of global warming. And so this is a real serious thing. And so what we need to do, here's the solution, although very difficult, we need to stabilize the use of fossil fuels. Okay, I don't have a great solution for that. I'm sorry about that. But it's such a huge problem, but I'll back it up and I'll say, I don't want to sort of scoff at it and say, really the answer to these kinds of huge issues, because sometimes you feel like you just can't do anything about it because you need to burn fossil fuels. Well, you can use less. You can, again, conserve in your own means, like your own household. You could drive less. You could use less energy in your house. And, it's like if you want to make a change, look in the mirror and change yourself, and then the world will be changed. That's what it's all about. I know it sounds a little corny or cliche, but this is how it happens. Be the change. So human activities are also, again, some of these chemicals that we're releasing into into our environment are actually affecting the ozone layer. Now, this is different than carbon dioxide. Ozone is O3. It's actually trioxygen. And what is ozone? It's another layer in the atmosphere that actually shields us from ultraviolet. Now, ultraviolet is an invisible type of radiation that comes down from the sun, and it can be rather dangerous. It could actually cause lethal damage, ultraviolet light. And so, but we have this ozone here in the earth that's protecting, except for the fact this big blue circle is where it's really, really thinning. So we're producing chemicals that are actually reacting with ozone in the atmosphere and breaking it down, or actually the truth of it is we're preventing it from forming. So we're depleting the ozone layer as well. And so we've been monitoring this for a couple of decades. How does ozone occur? You take a free radical of oxygen and then unite it with oxygen gas, and it produces ozone. And as it turns out, ozone shields the earth from ultraviolet. Interestingly enough, it's ultraviolet that actually causes the formation of ozone as well. But what happens is in the atmosphere, if there's too much chlorine ion, chlorine happens to be a little bit more electronegative than oxygen, and it sort of prevents ozone from forming. And so what's chlorine doing in the atmosphere? Because we produce chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. And so, what are we doing that for? Well, because we use these in our refrigerators and aerosol cans and all kinds of important uses in industry. But then when we started to realize that the ozone has been depleting, it's like we got to put a stop to this. So these are now being banned as a result of it. And so ultimately, we'll come to this conclusion. Sorry to leave you on a really sobering note, but it's not, sometimes we're like, gee, the ultraviolet light's going to hurt us. It's going to cause skin cancer. It's going to cause all these problems. And yes, all these things are true. But you have to understand that the most important organisms on the earth, the most numerous ones, are the bacteria, the prokaryotes in the soil, which make it all happen. All of the biogeochemical cycles, the nitrogen fixation, all the decomposition, it's all happening in the soil in these microorganisms. Ultraviolet light will kill those organisms. You kill those organisms, that's it. So this it's a serious issue. Serious issue. So again, as I said at the top of the video, what are we going to do about it? It's like, well, the first step is awareness. The second step is stepping up. And so I wish you well in that endeavor, and I support it. So thanks for watching this video on the human population and how it's increasing and it's disrupting the ecosystem. Thanks for watching.